David, thank you so much for joining us here today at Panmure House in Edinburgh, where Adam Smith once lived, to talk about his life and his work, particularly in the context of the economic problems of the 21st century. Of course, chiefly among them, climate change, but a host of other issues from nature, biodiversity, social issues. And to think about what Adam Smith would have thought and might have thought about those issues. So to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about, his life and his work?
Yeah, so, the first thing, he would have been really interested in them. Adam Smith wanted to solve problems. The Wealth of Nations is about, says, why do we study economics? It's so that the state has a proper income to look after the people, or rather that the people can make that income for themselves. So he's a practical person. I think the first thing that he would have said is, wow, what progress we've made since 1780. A lot of it by following suggestions that he was making about specialization and productivity and the building up of capital. We can talk about that maybe later. But I think particularly on stuff like climate, he will be saying, be really careful what you're doing here, because the very underpinnings, the natural underpinnings of our civilization depend on very basic things like a stable climate and the benefits of nature. And he doesn't in his writings spend a huge amount of time talking about that. He assumes that they're there 250 years ago. But let's be absolutely clear about this. The scientists are telling us that we're entering a new era if we don't do anything about this. And that is a absolutely fundamental issue that we might solve. And I have no doubt that that's what Adam Smith would be saying. And by the way, it's Hutton, his executor and his best friend, who invented modern geology. He would be saying exactly the same thing. So would Joseph Black, who was the other executive and the great chemist, the first to study carbon dioxide. We've got a really huge problem here. We need to be coping with that. Huge success over the last 250 years, but new problems, very big ones.
Mm. Yeah, of course, for Smith, it would have felt so natural to just, assume that the natural world was everlasting. That had never been called into question. However, his economics did talk about land quite a lot. He was very focused on land. Is that something you think could kind of come back into economics?
Smith's looking at what is quite an agricultural economy. And the debates that he's picking up on, particularly from the French, are about the land and the productivity of land. But where he's directing us towards, his great insight is, look, if you can create specialization, you can create productivity. Do you remember the Bank of England notes used to have the pin factory on it, where he describes the pin factory and the vast increase in productivity that you can get if you have specialization? And so why is he interested in free trade? Well, because free trade would create specialization, wouldn't it? Because you could have one person in Edinburgh who was making Edinburgh rock, and you could have another person in Brussels that was making Belgian chocolate, and they could trade with each other. So a specialization is where he's trying to get to, and the build-up of the capital that allows specialization. But his focus and his interest in land is particularly because he's looking at an agricultural economy. The big factories haven't really been built at the time that he's writing The Wealth of Nations. That comes later.
Mm. Mm. So he really kind of anticipated, in a way, the specialization of the factories. Rather than having one person, rolling out the pin, hammering the head, you divide those tasks.
Exactly, and he's rather a prophet of that. So his book is actually very influential in its time. But intriguingly, if you read it 50 years later, you think, wow, you imagine those Lowry paintings of the specialization and the textile factories and all of those sorts of things. You think to yourself, wow, that this has been prophetic of what it is that has happened over those two generations. But that's his real insight, and that's where his desire for free trade and open markets comes from. Open markets and free trade, as I read it in Smith, are not an end in themselves. They are a way of allowing greater productivity, therefore greater wealth, and greater welfare for the population. And it's the welfare of the population. That's what he's trying that's his objective in studying economics.
And of course, the open market for Smith it's a very different thing than the open market for us. I think it's very easy for us to lose sight of how tightly controlled economies were when he was writing, and how different a context he was living in.
Yeah. I mean, completely. I mean, if we're going back to the sort of the 1770s, you have extremely controlled economies in terms of trade, but also in terms of trades. So Adam Smith he's pretty against the guilds, where you need to do a 5-year apprenticeship in order to be able to do a relatively simple task. He's against those things that feel like they are monopolizing in order to prevent opportunity. He's unsympathetic, and I think one needs to recognize this. He's unsympathetic to what the guilds would have said, which is, hang on a minute, Adam. We don't want anybody practicing as a doctor. You need to have the proper qualifications before you do this. Now, Adam Smith might well have said that doctors in 1776 weren't doing very much for you, and perhaps that would have been his answer. But he's quite unsympathetic to that, and he's pushing for this sort of sense of freedom of trade and of competition, therefore supplying the things that people want.
So the free economy that he was arguing for is somewhat different than the kind of extreme laissez-faire economy that we see argued for in his name now.
So look, this is one thing that does get me about the sort of what we would call the neoclassical, new classical economists who say, look, I am borrowing from Smith's thought. And to some extent they are, but there's a huge amount of Smith's thought that they're ignoring. So neoclassical economics is highly mathematical. If you were to read a refereed economics or a finance journal today, you would discover it was in algebra and statistics and all of those sorts of disciplines. And there's no harm in that in and of itself. But in order to allow those techniques to be used, you need to make a whole load of assumptions. So you make assumptions, for example, that individuals are selfish and always trying to pursue their self-interest, that markets are always moving towards people trying to fulfill their self-interest, that if there's enough competition, that will generate welfare. Now, this is beginning to get a million miles away from Adam Smith's conception of what humans were like. The very first sentence of his second magnum opus, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he says, look, there is something in our nature that means that we are social animals, that we derive pleasure, fulfillment, and satisfaction in the pleasure, fulfillment, and satisfaction of others. And that is fundamental to human nature. So an assumption of what the economists would call homo economicus, economic man, is a million miles away from where Smith would have thought about humanity, but is one of the underpinning of neoclassical economics. And I think if Smith felt that the neoclassical economists were saying, Adam Smith told us all of this, he would be turning in his grave, which, by the way, is only about 100 meters from here.
Just outside that window.
Just outside that window, yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's such an interesting topic because, all these assumptions of Homo economicus, they're not, wholly unreasonable, but it's this requirement, if you want to make logical deductions, you have to start with assumptions.
With a whole load of simplification. That's absolutely right. And I think, therefore, we miss out on so many opportunities for thinking about other productive ways in which we might be doing things. It's not that, just by observation, bits of me are quite homo economicus. Yeah, I'm a normal human being. I want to satisfy my desires, but I'm not, nor is anybody I met a 100% selfish person. I do want to live in a decent society. I do want to live in a society where other people's values and opportunities for them are respected. And if that is the way I am, gosh, there must be opportunities to use that emotion in people to try and create productivity and all the rest of it, as well as to use the self-interested one. But I think we should be very clear. The very first sentence of the theory of moral sentiments is about humans as a social animal. There is a sentence in The Wealth of Nations about how it's not from the benevolence or the beneficence, I think, of the butcher, the brewer, and the baker that we get our dinner, that we pay them money, we appeal to their self-love. Now, that is a throwaway sentence. It's not a throwaway sentence, it's a significant sentence in his second book. It's not the very first sentence that he makes. His theory of moral sentiments is we are social animals. There's just got to be opportunity in extending the way that we think about the economic ecosystem that we live in to allow the theory of moral sentiments to play its role as well as the Wealth of Nations.
So kind of moving on a bit from sort of, the general kind of life and work of Smith and, what he may or may not have written in the very room in which we're talking now.
And by the way, he revised both his books in the 12 years that he was here. So you might say he wrote the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was his first work, and then he wrote The Wealth of Nations and changed his mind. That wasn't what happened. He thought they both stand together because he republished both of them in his latter years.
So two halves of a whole, almost, as opposed to two.
I think that's the way of thinking about it, Sam. Yeah.
So kind of moving on a little bit. So around the time of COP26, we worked together on this book, The Wealth of Nations in the 21st Century, and what that did was really try to just take inspiration from Smith and think about it in terms of the climate crisis. The book was divided into 5, as the original was. You wrote the second on capital or stock, as Smith called it. Can you tell us a little bit about that essay and how you kind of approached that?
Yes. So the second book it's about stock, so sort of machinery and buildings and cash and all of those sorts of things. And we could remember that Smith was living at a time where, insofar as there were economic theories, they were kind of mercantilist, which was, let's see how much gold we can get into our country, and then we'll have all the gold and we'll be better than everybody else. And Smith, as a critic of that, saying, no, let's have lots and lots of trade. Yeah, we'll buy other people's stuff, and give them our gold back. But there is a slightly mercantilist thing where he is very strong on, look, we need to build the capital of the nation. And by that he means the buildings, the machinery, the things that make people more productive. And I mean, he's pretty clear on this. I mean, he takes, if somebody says, should I be spending my money on a nice dinner or should I be spending my money on a piece of machinery? He'd always go for the piece of machinery. Yeah, he's quite strong on this indeed. So he wants to build the capital. It allows specialization, it allows productivity. That's what he's trying to achieve. Now, of course, there are all sorts of different capital. There is machinery, there is buildings, there is bullion. He's not so interested in the bullion. He's only interested in the productivity stuff. But there's also natural capital. And at the time he mentions natural capital, he says, for example, the value of the land is the rent that you get on the land is the natural capital. To that you add the farm workers, but the natural capital. But he sort of says nature's there and it provides this amazing dividend for us. And then he goes back to focus on what is it that human beings can do with that protection of nature. Of course, if he was here today, he'd be saying, listen, guys, for a generation now, scientists have been blowing the whistle that you're going to run out of this natural capital. If you do, that's absolutely catastrophic. And the last 250 years of economic wealth that you've built, some of it listening to the principles of Adam Smith, will be destroyed if you don't secure natural capital. I mean, it's a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's almost an accounting point in here about, if you draw down from your natural resources, you shouldn't be able to express that as a flow. That should be a kind of decrease in the stock almost.
That is exactly the point. That if we don't value natural capital, if we assume that it's costless to destroy our environment, we will destroy, undermine everything, including the value of the factories and the buildings and all of those sorts of things, and the learning and all of that sort of stuff that Smith would have encouraged us to invest in. So I would be pretty clear that Adam Smith would be shouting that from the rooftops, and that those who say it's okay just to let free markets run and pollute the environment simply have not understood by a country mile what it was Adam Smith told us.
Mm. And on natural capital, there are some people who feel that putting a price on nature is a way of kind of putting a price on its destruction.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that view?
If I can go back to Adam Smith, I'm trying to create a world that is a truly prosperous world for everybody. If putting a price on nature helps create that prosperous world, I would go for putting a price on nature. And I used to think that was theoretically correct as well, but I remember going to the Rio Plus 20 conference. There was a protest outside of tribespeople from the Amazon. And they were furious at the thought that anyone was going to put a price on the world in which they lived, because they said it's priceless. Yeah, I think we should have that in mind as well. But if we're going to think about this, we need to think about practical mechanisms for stopping this destruction. And, I think if Adam Smith was here today, he would start with some of those numerical things. So, for example, he would say there's $300 billion a year that is used in direct subsidy to the fossil fuel industry whose products are destroying the environment. Why are you doing that? Why do you have that market intervention? We should cut those. By the way, the additional destruction that is done by fossil fuels is about $5 trillion. That's a really, really, really very, very big sum indeed. Why are you not taxing that $5 trillion of destruction? I think that would probably be the first place that Adam Smith would go to, and very true to the wealth of nations, never mind the theory of moral sentiments, very true to the wealth of nations just to do that, because that's what creates true prosperity. And he would be saying, guys, if you forget natural capital, you will be in trouble. And there's a lead time to this as well, Sam. If you forget natural capital in 2022, you may be reaping the benefits in 2040.
Smith might have offered an answer of why do we offer these subsidies, and something of the people of the same trade gathering together. And
yeah, I think he would. The notion that we've got the fossil fuel industry lobbying would be absolutely the sort of anti-guild activity that would have made him furious. Yeah, and the subsidy, absolutely, he would have been hugely against. I'm pretty sure of that.
We talked a lot, in November of last year about COP26. 6 months on from that, do you think that the world has sort of responded properly? At the time we said, what would Smith have said to this summit?
Well, it's not enough, is it? It's not enough in terms of the governmental agreements that we've reached. We're not predicting, even if people stick to their promises, that we're going to be within the 2 degrees, still less the 1.5 degrees C that we would like to be at. And there was progress made at the COP, but it kind of feels like the sort of progress that was made in military efforts in World War I. So much effort for 400 yards of muddy ground. It is clear what it is that we need to do, and yet we don't have governmental agreement on that, which would be the best way to go. We have agreement on what needs to be done and lots of announcements from the finance industry, But is this really moving the dial at the speed that it needs to be moved at? It's difficult to argue that it is.
So in terms of the ways forward that we can go, I mean, I think there's so many different roads. There's, thinking about auditors and, what's the right way to audit a company. There's regulations and, how do we kind of implement TCFD and that sort of thing, the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Yeah. How quickly do we need to be changing these things, and what can we do to change?
Yeah, and then what impact will they have? So, look, first of all, finance sits as part of a wide panoply of things that need to be done, where, frankly, the people that we'd like to see take the leading action, I think, are the policymakers. And I led the finance initiative in the run-up to the Paris COP. We did this huge petition of investment funds just saying, please, can you do a tough deal? We need, carbon tax, subsidies stopped, all of those sorts of things. And the policymakers are. So are the scientists, who are going to come up with the new ways of doing things. But so, by the way, are the people who recycle their cans and their plastic, and the people more noble than me who don't go on foreign holidays because they don't want. I mean, all of these behaviours have got to change. But finance does play a key part in all of this. And it would seem to me, Sam, that finance has got two roles. One is to make sure that the money is getting to the places that it needs to and not going to the places where it must not go to. And that is sometimes a case of just making sure that the loans aren't made. But it's also a case of making sure that the powers that the finance industry has, which it has because it owns the shares in companies, that those are used to make sure that companies are trading sustainably. And it's in everybody's interest that companies trade sustainably.
Well, it is an interesting point, because I think, there are many in the finance industry who would say that they would like to take more action on climate change, but they also feel that they are acting as agents on behalf of other people. They don't own the money themselves. The money is pensions, high net worth individuals, and their role as financiers is to kind of act out the wishes of those people. Do we then need regulation in order to make sure that, actually the wishes of those people are not consistent with the continued survival of life on Earth?
I've talked about the need for regulation. I'd be in favour of regulation, but I'd take exactly the same starting point and say, that's right, it's not your money. And I'm guessing that most people of your age who are starting to think about saving for a pension, if they were offered that they were going to get a pension in a world that was sustainable, or they were going to get a pension where we were writing off half the investments because we had needed to make a dramatic response to catastrophic climate change, which made life and economies almost impossible for you and your children as you reached my age, that in your interests, you would want things to be sustainable. Indeed, I find it absolutely extraordinary that somebody would turn around and say, I'm trying to represent the money of millions and millions of pensioners, and I think it would be a jolly good idea that I invested in a way that was going to destroy the very planet that they live on. Absolutely extraordinary. So the starting point of this is other people's money, which it is the starting point that leads you to, and therefore it must be invested sustainably.
So it's not so much a change of regulation while necessary, but a change of just the mindset of how we value investments, how we value assets.
Exactly. It's getting a system that is one that makes it as easy as possible for folk to say that sustainability is the natural way to behave. So let me give an example. It's one that's taken up rather more of my time than I intended a few years ago. It sort of came out of Paris. And right now, companies tend to want to make as much profit as they possibly can, over the long term or whatever. So why are they continuing to invest, for example, in new oil exploration, where the independent panel on climate change would say, look, we do not need any more. We've discovered all the oil that we possibly need to discover. Well, they do that because the accounting rules tell them that it's profitable to do that. So surely we should have accounting rules that just say, it's not profitable to do that. If everybody does that, somebody's going to have to write off all of those assets. All those assets that are owned by other people's money, those other people are going to suffer a loss. Stop doing that. So we need to think about accounting standards. We need to think about who we appoint to boards of directors. We need to think about whether banks ought to be lending money to these sorts of new projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that needs to become a normal part of what the finance industry does. And it does it not because it has to, even though its clients don't want it to. It does it because that must be what its clients want it to do. And to fail to do that is close to a breach of your duties of good faith to the people whose money you're managing.
And I think that, that kind of good faith aspect colours a lot of the finance industry's reluctance to move on, but it also, as you kind of so well express, it's kind of why the finance industry must move on and must change.
I think that's right, Sam, and I think as well that if it was me, I would love people to push the people whose money it is, to push their pension funds a little bit further on saying, look, how are you using my money? So, for example, in Britain, the system of corporate governance is super democratic. Every year, the directors of big companies are re-elected. Couldn't we just ask them, will they promise, again, in good faith, they'll sometimes make mistakes, but in good faith, could they manage their companies in a way that they truly believe will be sustainable and consistent with a sustainable world? And if they won't do that, could they please not stand for re-election, or we will vote for somebody else? Wouldn't that be a nice thing that we did? And if you did that, imagine that every big company in the world was run by people who were really trying hard, and it will be hard, to run them in a way that's going to be sustainable. I think that would be something that the people who are the beneficiaries of the pension funds, who are the people who are the beneficial owners of all the shares, that would be what they would want. But it would be great, wouldn't it, if the people who were those beneficial owners, they told their pension funds, and the pension fund told the investment manager, and the investment manager told the companies. That's hardly happening right now. It's more than it was 20 years ago, but it's still a bit marginal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that's so difficult to do, and the traditional setup has been of kind of we handle this for you. We do this so that you don't have to think about it. Exactly. And that's a difficult mindset to change.
Yes,
of course.
Exactly.
I was very interested that you kind of mentioned the elections of boards of directors to big companies there, because big companies, joint stock companies, was actually something Smith wrote quite a lot about. And in fact, you talk about him being kind of very prescient about different ways in which the economy would evolve. He probably missed a bit of a trick on joint stock companies.
He thought joint stock companies were a terrible idea, and he observed the world and noted that when you did have joint stock companies, that the people who were on the boards seemed to get terribly rich, whereas the people that were lending the money often didn't. And he said his phrase was, negligence and profusion will always prevail in joint stock companies. And he thought that really you'd only ever want to have a public company if a huge amount of money was involved. So if it was a bank or an insurance company or a canal company or a water company, he didn't think any other company would be well run. But actually, we've got a large part of our economy that is now run through big quoted companies. Walk down your high street, most of them are big quoted companies, who provides you with your electricity and your car and all of those sorts of things. And the reason that we've been able to do that is that we've created a set of institutions, which include all that voting and democracy stuff, that have meant that, by and large, those companies are relatively honestly run, certainly way, way more honestly than they were in Adam Smith's day. And they have been one of the great engines for growth and prosperity. So there's lots of things that are wrong with them, and I can bore for Britain on what's wrong with them, but actually they've been one of the great engines for prosperity, and Adam Smith would have said, yeah, I got that one wrong, I think.
You think that's somewhere where he would have maybe liked to make one more edition of The Wealth of Nations?
Well, it's intriguing, because when I was reading Adam Smith, partly for the essay that you had me write, I was thinking, well, why do we now just assume away? If you do an economics course, nobody says public companies are a terrible idea. They're just part of the scenery. What happened? And there was, that's partly because they all study the mathematics of it all rather than the sociology of it all. But there's a very famous economist, Alfred Marshall, who wrote the textbook for about 50 years that everybody used. And he discusses this. And he says the only reason that I can discover that these companies have not been characterized by negligence and profusion is because of an uprightness and morality in commercial affairs that was not apparent 100 years ago. So that actually the sociology of commerce was important. Adam Smith might have said, oh, maybe some of those people that were running those companies, maybe the Quakers who founded the original Barclays Bank, for example, or the chocolate companies, maybe they did think that it was part of their nature to take pleasure in the success of others, that they were social animals as well as being Homo economicus.
Yeah, I think, in some instances, it seems like maybe the uprightness and morality was shared more among peers than perhaps among society at large. We don't want to do wrong by stock owners, but the natural environment was not afforded the same courtesy.
Yes, and Luke, so you ask really interesting questions there, Sam, about, well, who are you responsible to? I would say, if you're a board of directors, first of all, read the law. It's to all of your shareholders after having given consideration to all the other stakeholders. And when we say all your shareholders, we mean all of them. That's millions upon millions of people saving for pensions all around the world. And that should frame what you do. But it is only natural that people consider the folk that are closest to them. Indeed, there is a chapter in the Theory of Moral Sentiments that goes in some depth into all of that. And Adam Smith, his one of his best friends was David Hume, outstanding philosopher of the time. But he had investments involved with the slave trade to such a degree that Edinburgh University has decided it won't call one of its buildings the Hume Building, which I think I understand why they've done it, but for such a great thinker, seems a pity. But look, that debate about who is it that you're responsible to for companies is millions upon millions of people who are your stakeholders and who are also your beneficial shareholders. And under those circumstances, willingly and knowingly doing something that is undermining sustainability and long-term natural capital that we will have to pay the cost for is simply something that you have to stop doing. And your shareholders, or the agents of your shareholders, the big fund managers of this world, should be making sure that they're putting pressure on you to do that.
So is this tension between your responsibility to your shareholders as shareholders and your responsibility to your shareholders as citizens, almost?
Yes, that is right. Your shareholders are ultimately people. Yeah. They're not Fidelity and BlackRock. They are millions and millions of people. And just the same way as if somebody said to you, look, I'm a doctor and I can really fix that difficult knee that you've got. I'm sorry it's going to give you brain damage, but I can fix your knee. You would say, well, I don't want to have brain damage. To say, look, I can invest in a way that I think is going to put an extra pound in your pocket for well, it won't for your pension, because by the time you take your pension, the climate will be doing, but it put an extra pound in your pocket financially, but will destroy the very environment in which you live. You'd say, no, thank you. I do not want that knee operation. And no doctor would do that knee operation. But yet our financiers seem to be able to persuade themselves that if this trade allows them to beat the market and temporarily make a profit, that they can turn a blind eye to the larger responsibilities. That can't be right, can it?
Yeah. It's interesting how that kind of ties into, the very start of this conversation with, talking about Smith's views on specialization. to what extent has that specialization and separation of roles allowed us to have these kind of siloed viewpoints?
Yeah, absolutely. And, have you got yourself so specialized in a global economy that you've lost sight of the other 7 billion people on the globe, to whom moral sentiments are due?
Do you have any kind of final thoughts on, what advice Smith might have given us?
He would have said all that stuff we talked about to the policymakers. I mean, we've got to put a cost on things that are a cost. We've got to stop these subsidies. I think one thing we've not touched on for financiers that he would say is when he talks about finance, he's pretty skeptical about whether banks can do their job right, because he thinks if you're going to lend people money, you need to know a lot about them. Yeah. And you need to have a society where you understand the rules of the game. I think he's right on that. And actually, our northern banks, where the money lies, and our northern financial institutions where the money lies, simply do not know how you invest money in the south. And we need to invest vast amounts of money in the south if we're going to persuade them not to follow the same development path that we did. So I would say, he might say, you need something like a Marshall Plan. Yeah, which is how are we really going to transfer big sums of money? And then I think he would say, look, insofar as you are controlling the northern finance industry, stop putting new money into stuff that is not sustainable. It doesn't make financial sense, and it doesn't make sense in terms of natural capital, which all go together. Stop electing people to those wonderful public companies if they won't make the right commitments. Stop insuring those companies for environmental damage. Why would you ever do stuff like that? Stop having accounting standards that make things look profitable that can't possibly be profitable. So he would go through those sorts of things. And actually, knowing Adam Smith, he would have gone through those details because he loved all those details about the way that institutions and systems work. And I think he would look at what was done at Glasgow and say, you're all expressing exactly the right sentiments, but you guys have got to change this into systems that have the right impact in delivering a sustainable world, because the alternative is an unsustainable world where all capital is destroyed. And that's your number one challenge of the 21st century. And I think he would say, read both my books, and maybe there's some ideas there.
David Pitt-Watson, thank you very, very much. It's been a really enlightening conversation.